Hello my dears, I saw this article over the summer called "Nobody is a Personality Anymore" being talked about positively by a couple like media analysis, social commentary creators that I follow, so I bookmarked it to make a video about eventually, and now it's eventually. We're not talking about how long it takes me to get around to things, don't worry about it. Now that I've read this article, I am realizing that either those creators didn't read the article in its entirety, which very well could be the case. The publication has a particularly sticky paywall that I struggled a lot to get around, and I just ended up finding a different publication that had functionally the same article by the same person. Or they're not as good at critical media analysis as I thought these people were, because there is this undertone to this article that just felt a little off to me. And also then I realized that it's published by the Free Press, which is a right-leaning publication sort of framing itself in this so-called centrist, I'm just asking questions, I'm trying to get to the bottom of things, that's all sort of tone. But based on online conversations around this article, it seems like I am not the only one who didn't quite look at the name of the host publication or otherwise know anything about it until something felt off, and then I did some research and learned what this organization stands for. In hindsight, it being called the Free Press probably should have been the first red flag. Anyway, the article has little to no journalistic integrity, don't get me wrong, under no circumstance do I recommend it, but I do think it's a great jumping off point for a wider conversation about labeling that I have with people in my life from time to time. Also, a caveat before we jump into it, I firmly believe in citing all sources. You will find a citation document linked in the description below for you. This is one of those videos where I do not agree with and or recommend a large majority of the things that are in my source list because many of them contain significant bias and or misinformation. They're just jumping off points of the extremes on either end to fuel the wider discussion here. So just be super aware of that should you choose to look at that for further reading or for watching. I do have a few other videos on similar versions of this topic, like the Cult of Trauma and Mental Illness TikTok, and I'll link those below for you as a less biased source. I mean, obviously I'm biased because it's my own source, but you know what I mean. Also, video description, sorry, I'm a white person with light brown, just beyond shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing a navy blue button-up shirt and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Amazing. So the central argument of this article is that we have as a society replaced personality traits with diagnoses. And the image it uses is of a bunch of contestants in a beauty pageant wearing sashes that say depression and OCD and ADHD and PTSD and neurotic on them. And the argument behind the argument is that nobody's allowed to just be weird anymore, we all have to have a thing. The author used this to make an argument that is fundamentally flawed and actively disingenuous, but if we put that to the side for a moment and just take it at face value, I think this is a really important discussion because it can be true, depending on what social circles you're in. I've talked before in this channel about the issues with TikTok and otherwise social media diluting various DSM diagnoses with like if you can memorize the lyrics to an unusually high number of songs, you're autistic, or like having trouble putting down your phone to focus on work, that's ADHD, where a lot of personal experiences that may or may not be linked to somebody's condition are being treated as if they are clinical traits of that condition, and then shared as relatability content and like educational content that can really confuse people as to what a certain disorder actually is and what the experiences of it can look like, both in causing people who don't have that thing to start to think perhaps they do, and in spreading misinformation that turns these things socially into quirky differences rather than like the debilitating disabilities that they happen to be. I think there is a lot of good, to be clear, that has come from the recent explosion of mental health content on the internet. It's really expanded resources for people who are otherwise unable to access those resources or just be able to see other people with a similar lived experience. It also happened during the pandemic, a time of great stress and trauma for literally everybody, so it made a lot of sense that people are going to relate to mental health content that otherwise wouldn't have beforehand because we're tired and everything sucks and we're very isolated, so of course our brains are going to feel real bad, and that will better highlight the pieces of us that fit DSM criteria because the way we diagnose mental disability is primarily related to distress. The pandemic also destroyed a lot of people's social skills, and so it's not uncommon to meet people who relate a lot to a lot of autistic content, but don't actually relate to any of the pieces of autism beyond the social pieces of it, which means it's not autism, but I find this particularly fascinating. Now, as much as it's great that social media has expanded access and community to some extent, it's also a for-profit venture, and so there comes a point where at best it's people making personal content trying to help others that is uninformed and harmful, and at worst it's people trying to sell you a certain story so that they can sell you a certain product or coaching or whatever. But I think it's because of this explosion in content around these things and the fact that so many people have recently been diagnosed or have related to diagnostic related content and feel like they might be in that group, both including people who like have well researched their self-diagnosis and like know things, and people who are like, yeah, I guess I vibe with these people, so I must have the same thing they do category. Online social currency sort of revolves around name-dropping diagnoses, and that, depending on which social circles you're in, and this usually correlates to what social circles are more online, tends to bleed out into real life. I've been in many conversations where there's been a sort of expectation that you will automatically disclose what you have, or where people will comment on a behavior and go like, oh, you're autistic, aren't you? Or have you been tested for ADHD? And I'm in sort of two camps on this matter. On one side, I feel like it's inappropriate and a bit of an overstep to bring it up in that manner. Like, if you want to say you have something, that's fine. But to automatically joke about somebody else's assumed neurodivergence without knowing that to be the case, which could end up in a situation where you're trying to armchair diagnose this person, potentially without their consent, not great. This also extends to the focus on diluted diagnoses rather than individual human traits. That is the issue. But on the other side, in the queer community, we do this all the time. Like, we often call people gay without being 100% sure. We make plenty of jokes about somebody being an identity that maybe they're not aware of yet or may never actually be. I had people joke about me being potentially trans long before I even thought about it as a possibility, and it didn't really bother me because I was like, well, I know who I am, so it doesn't really matter. And I think queerness is a great example of semi-invisible identity to sort of gut check this with a little bit, because many of those things also used to be diagnostic terms that have now been removed from the diagnostic space and now exist solely as identity. And I don't think anything currently in the DSM will be able to do that to the extent that queerness has, nor do I think it should, because it serves a very different purpose. But I do know that the most radical in our community sort of wanted to move in that direction, particularly with developmental disability, so it is a thing to just keep an eye on. But what I think is different between a queer person asking if you're queer and somebody asking if you have a mental disability is like the social connotations and the impact of a response are fundamentally different, so the stakes are not the same at all. And that the queer community tends to respect the existence of the closet, so they phrase stuff differently, so it's a little bit less direct. Like, when you think that somebody is somewhat gender non-conforming, you might ask their pronouns, or you ask indirect questions to try to gauge what kinds of people a person is into, usually because either you want to date them or you want your friend to date them. So there's also subtext of this is why I want to know this information that is helpful in that situation. And then once you know this, you start joking more freely about things because you know that you're both in the know, so it's a safe space to do so. Whereas with diagnoses, it tends to just be like a direct question. And I also find it often comes from outside of the community, from non-disabled people trying to understand for themselves why you're like that so that they can categorize it and explain it better for themselves. And I feel like to some extent, that is a thing people are internalizing as well. So it's sort of like a, I'm not weird or cringy, I just have insert disorder, as a way to feel less self-conscious about being different. I could go on a whole separate tangent about younger generation's fear of being embarrassing or odd that is definitely linked with the knowledge that things are constantly filmed and saved and put online without people's consent, so that leads to sort of constant self-surveillance and fear of cringe and expectation of constant perfection and normalcy when surrounded by other people. I'm not going to go on that tangent, but I do think that's a huge piece of the puzzle. You can't make fun of me because I have a mental disability, and making fun of the behavior of mentally disabled people is wrong. Like, protection measures sort of baked into this constant need to share these identities. I also can acknowledge my very unique position here because my username on all platforms is disabled autistic lesbian. But when I meet people in person, they often don't know that, and I don't really make it a habit of disclosing anything unless necessary. I talk about being a disability media historian, and I mentioned that I tend to have a research focus on mental disability, but I don't really extend beyond that unless it's critically important for the point of like a story that I'm telling or a concept I'm explaining, or I'm asking for a slight accommodation. But even then, I will usually pinpoint the trait that I need accommodated, and I won't say where it comes from. It's usually auditory processing issues or like a light in my direct line of vision. And this is also kind of standard in my field. In my experience, it's not unique to me at all. I think there's a sort of outside expectation that people working in the disability sphere all know about each other's disabilities and we talk about it a lot. I don't know the disabilities of the vast majority of my colleagues in this field. I find that nobody really asks unless it's related to education around lived experience or like a lived experience research question, or it's a direct accommodation thing. I know enough about disability, I could probably guess and probably be right the majority of the time, but often I will have known somebody for years and they'll mention something offhandedly that I did not know. This happens all the time, which is not to say that disability isn't a huge part of our identity and a piece of who we are as people, and also like a core piece of our job. I just find that we focus more on the overarching group than we do on specific individual lived experiences, and any more specific identity discussions tend to be more academically related or pointing out a thing that was forgotten about in a particular space. I don't know if any of that made sense, but I think what I'm trying to say here is that there's a difference between a discussion of labels as a sociological experience that happens to relate to individual experience versus, hi, I'm telling you my identity markers, which is not really what we do. And when I meet people outside of my field who hear about what I do, I find they usually very quickly choose the latter option and disclose their own mental disabilities immediately as a way to sort of say like, hey, I'm like you, we're in community, I get it. Which, to be clear, it's fine and it makes sense because there is a different tone to somebody in community wanting to know my thoughts on The Greatest Showman and Curious Incident versus somebody outside of the community wanting to know the same information. The same way that I feel more at ease when a queer person asks me about my experience of gender than I do if like a random person on the street did, right? And that sort of brings us into this question of like, well, why do we label? Which I feel like this article and lots of other similar discussions decide to actively avoid, because there are reasons we label stuff. The first thing, like in that story that I just told, is they're a great shorthand to give very quick context. I don't need to say, I have sensory processing issues and I struggle to understand what's happening in loud places and I miss social cues sometimes. I can just say, I'm autistic, and that covers all of those bases. Same with sexuality. I don't need to say, yeah, I'm not into men, but I do date women. I can just say, yeah, I'm a lesbian. I don't need to describe my personal relation to gender either, which is complicated and even I don't know sometimes. I can just say I'm non-binary and these are my pronouns and we all move on. When it comes to my autism though, I know that everybody has slightly different understandings of what autism actually means, so I will usually pinpoint the specific need that I'm having just for clarity's sake. But if I start to have like a meltdown somewhere, I'm autistic is short, sweet, and to the point, and that's usually what I would use in that situation. This label for a thing is a very quick way to tell somebody else what's going on, especially if things seem out of the norm, both for people in community to go, hey, I'm in that minority with you, I get it, and for people on the outside to have a better understanding of the thing that is different. And with the latter, there is an important distinction here between explanation and excuse. Like if I were frustrated at a friend for being consistently terrible at texting me back because they clear the notification and then they always forget about it, that does dissipate a bit when I learn that it's not that they don't value me as a person and they actually hate me, it's that they have ADHD and they're thus constantly scattered and they forget things. And I can also say, that's not the kind of, relationship that I want to have because our communication styles are not compatible. It's sad that I'm not as close to that person as I would want to be, but I don't feel like they personally hate me because they never respond to my messages because I understand what's going on. So we hold both things concurrently. And for that person, knowing that they have ADHD helps them to know why this keeps happening to them no matter how hard they try, and if they want to go about making it better, opens a pathway for finding solutions that work for the way that their brain functions, rather than trying to just brute force a different behavior and then be angry and shameful at themselves for not being able to change. Labels also help us to feel like we belong somewhere. There are so many stories of people growing up thinking they weren't smart and would never be able to learn things or achieve what they wanted, only to learn they're dyslexic and find a community of people like them and tips and tricks to find the life that they wanted, or to accept that there are many different kinds of success and find something new that works better for them that is accommodating of their disability. These experiences can be uniquely isolating, and finding these words for the people who are like you and then finding those people makes you feel a lot less alone, which makes quality of life significantly better. Like there is quite a difference between, yeah, my head hurts all the time and I'm dizzy a lot, and I have chronic migraine. The first one sucks, and the second one opens up the possibility of migraine treatment, as well as a whole community of people who have learned to live with them and how they cope with both the actual pain and with like the terror of never knowing when one's going to happen. Labels also help us to start conversations around stuff we might not otherwise think about. I remember the very first time I met a non-binary person, I asked them what that meant to them, and we talked about gender for like an hour, and at that point in my life I never really thought about gender or about how I felt in my body because it never concretely crossed my mind. I never had the language for it, but that conversation got the ball rolling for me, and then over the course of the next couple months I thought more about it and I came out as non-binary. I also firmly believe that I would not have realized I was a lesbian unless somebody had literally told me it was an option. Like I don't think my brain would have gotten there by itself. But I think this actually happened the most with micro-labels, especially in the queer community. Many of them I don't feel actually shortcut any form of communication unless you're within that very specific sub-niche of the community, because they are terms used so infrequently and thus require extensive explanation for most people. I am acknowledging, of course, that most gender and sexuality terms common today began as those, and over time many of these will become more mainstream knowledge. This is how language works. We're gonna slightly ignore that for the sake of this example, but those things operate as a great way to have conversations about stuff that you've never thought about before. Even if you don't relate to any of the specific labels in the category, well, you know more things about yourself than you did before that conversation, and that's super beneficial. Are there issues with labels? Absolutely. People use them as excuses for bad behavior. That's usually the primary critique that comes up. But also, let's not pretend like that's new. Like, I promise you that if these people did not have diagnoses to use as excuses, they would be using something else. There's also the semi-dilution of them, like we've already talked about, with every social media platform trying to convince you that the way that you breathe means you have XYZ disorder and you should follow them to learn more about it. And there's also a weird kind of discrimination where people sort of like almost disingenuously try to label other people, like the whole "is it acoustic" trend, where people just see somebody being odd and really want to call them a slur related to autism really badly, or every androgynous person being they, them'd and assumed non-binary even though those aren't their pronouns. But that's just kind of, unfortunately, a side effect of words that categorize things and how humans think about categories. People kind of we like to categorize stuff because it makes us feel like we have control over things and that we understand things, and that is always going to result in some semblance of an overgeneralization. That doesn't mean those overgeneralizations aren't problems, like they can be racist and sexist and ableist and all of those things and whatever, but two things can be true, right? Now, labels also can be kind of stressful. Sometimes that's because you've been given one by others or by the universe that feels kind of scary to you, maybe because it doesn't fit or because it does fit a lot and the reality of what that means is very intimidating. Like, it was kind of nice to know I didn't just get headaches super often randomly. I had chronic migraines that were caused by things, but that also meant that there weren't a whole lot of great treatments for the thing and that it was going to be a more consistent problem throughout my life rather than a right now issue that I could immediately fix with like one medication. And I remember when I was first diagnosed, watching lots of content by people with chronic migraines, being really scared at like what my future was going to look like because it was going to be different than I imagined. I also felt very similarly when I came out as queer. I was like, oh, everything is different, and that is really scary to me. It can also be stressful if everybody around you keeps insisting you're a certain thing and you haven't figured that out yet, or you have and you know that that just does not fit, but other people insist that it does fit for you. And there's also the stress of feeling like you have to decide on a label right now. I know when I was younger and I knew I was somewhere in the queer category, I felt like I had to choose which words were my words as soon as possible in order to count and actually be welcomed into the community. I actually felt that way about autism as well. I didn't like let myself consume any autism related content or resources until I had a diagnosis written on a piece of paper because I felt like I wasn't welcome in the community otherwise. In hindsight, not how either of those things work, but at the time I felt so much pressure to decide on those things. Partially because when I would talk to other people about trying to figure these things out for myself, they would try to fit me with words from the outside to see if, you know, they could gauge where I landed, which made me feel like those things mattered way more than they actually did. And one of the points in this godforsaken article that this video isn't really about did sort of acknowledge this, saying that we see everything as a problem to be solved rather than just being human nature, insinuating that we're always looking for what's wrong and how to fix it, or at least very least put a word to it. And I don't think that's entirely off the mark, but she attributes the issue as being one of a generation rather than a wider structural issue. Like, of course we're going to be constantly looking for shorthand to describe ourselves and find our people. That's how the internet works, which is where most of us had all of our friends during lockdown and then for years after. Knowing what keywords relate to you and how you find other people like you is how the internet works. And specifically how niche sub-communities that are less likely to find each other in real life and have to find each other online are going to communicate with one another, again, because it's how the internet works. We also live in a world where kids are expected to have their 15-year plan sorted by the time they graduate elementary school. You need to know what makes you different and what you want to do with your life and start thinking about college very early on. You don't actually need to do that, but the world makes you feel like you need to do that. So of course this is what makes me stand out from other people and this is what makes me different thing is going to dominate social thought in our age groups. We also live in a world where struggles don't matter and help is not offered unless it's a diagnostic issue because accommodation and flexibility is not standard. So in order to cater anything to what your needs are as a person, you need to have a label. And this extends beyond the kids these days argument. It is an everybody thing. You're not really allowed to get a day off of work unless you have a documented diagnostic reason for needing it. You're not allowed to rest until you are ill. And categorizing everybody's struggles with the system as pathology that each individual needs to deal with personally is sort of standard. Not to say that mental disability isn't real, we're not going that far, absolutely not. There is a healthy middle ground here. It's more that all mental disability is real and also a massive chunk of it is related to the social structures that are in place, and blaming that on the individual keeps the gears turning. And so I think it's interesting that there's this young people care too much about diagnosing personality traits. What's their problem? Point of view. Because I feel like young people are the people who are really leading more conversations around this being a wider societal problem because of how much pathology has been sort of given to our generations, for lack of a better way to phrase that, and how these things can be both societal and individual, rather than assuming that struggling to cope with things is unnatural and a personal failure like has been the case historically. It very much feels like a squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of situation where the systems are telling us how to squeak the loudest because we need to, while simultaneously getting angry at us for squeaking at all. So is it really any wonder that the people who get the most mad about the situation are the conservatives who seek to keep the status quo and silence minority groups? Crazy. One thing about this article that was really highlighted for me on my second read was the idea that labels actually box people in and prevent people from being able to grow and change. I think to some extent they can create echo chambers of some sort where people just go, okay, this is how I am, whatever, and continue doing things that are harmful to other people and or themselves. But again, not a new thing. Some people are always gonna kind of suck, and they will always use whatever explanation they can for that makes themselves feel better about that fact. This just happens to be the one that is currently popular. But also this assumption that labels are something that box people in comes from people who have very restrictive views of what those labels mean, with the idea that labels are there to prescribe who a person is, rather than describe a thing that is already happening. We're not boxing somebody in by saying they're a blonde person. They might feel a little strange should they choose to go brunette, but we're not staring at a brunette and calling them blonde until their hair changes color. We're just describing a thing that already exists. And just like hair color is fluid, most other supposedly restrictive labels are also pretty fluid. I think there's this view from the outside of these communities that inside of them we're asking for your card carrying label so we can decide where you fit. I mean, again, I thought that entering the queer community because I was unsure, I was nervous, I was insecure, so I figured that having a sure term for myself would give me some footing in that world to find where I belonged. But then once I was a part of it for long enough, I realized that I was just trying to trade in conformity because that was kind of all that I knew and understood. I was like, well, I'm not this group, so I need to find which microgroup I fit in. When actually, very few people in the community actually majorly care. You can say, I'm this specific label, and people will go, that's cool. You can also say, I don't know, man, gender and sexuality are soup, but I'm not straight and cis, and people will be just as cool with that. And if they're not, they're insecure and they have their own host of issues. There are also certain labels that cover a really large swath of things and or change situationally. So to me, those are just conversation starters rather than a concrete label. And that can also lead to a conversation as to how much a label is actually effective at doing its job as a piece of identity if it does change that constantly. Argue about that in the comments if you like. This fluidity also can be the case in the disability community to some extent, though that's not very well reflected by how people interact from the outside. But like, I have known people who have been through all kinds of perspective diagnoses before finding the one that actually describes their experience. But each one along the way taught them something and was educational and made things a bit clearer and gave them some sort of community to hang out with to figure out, you know, how to make their lives a little bit better. I also know many people who know they have a condition in some vague category that has little to no treatment, so they haven't bothered to figure out what it is because they don't care and it doesn't matter. I find that once people have really settled into who they are and what they need from the world, labels feel less like a sticker to put on your chest to feel like you fit in, and more like a thing that's just part of who you are that you mention offhandedly when it's applicable. But without having it initially as the sticker on the chest of a very nervous little me, I wouldn't have gotten to this place now where it feels like something worn into who I am as a person. That's just like part of the journey. I also think there's an interesting discussion about our insistence in using labels that define and reinforce the typical and the atypical, because at some point that's no longer liberatory because master's tools, especially because much of this so-called liberation involves actively putting down those who are the most vulnerable in our communities. Intellectually disabled people and higher support needs people, for example, just to get a leg up. That is a whole other conversation I do not have the bandwidth to get into today. You're also welcome to argue about that in the comments. But there is this outside view of our communities that assumes that all we do is argue about which 15 micro labels you identify with that you can put in a giant list, and so people think we are restricted by them, which also feels disingenuous because many of these things we now pathologize used to have other labels to describe them that were very unkind, unhelpful, and actively derogatory, and have now changed to be something a bit more neutral that doesn't carry a lot of individual shame. I mean, introversion and extroversion used to be diagnostic, and now those things are more or less neutral. In fact, much of our language in describing stuff comes from Freud. He completely revolutionized how people communicated about things and how they use scientific language. So did eugenics. We have been semi-misappropriating scientific language to label things and pathologize things for a very long time. Most of it is just detached enough from its historical understanding at this point that people don't really realize where it came from. This article goes into this whole good old days thing where it tries to say that this generation is too self-centered. You know what? I'm just gonna read this quote rather than try to rephrase it poorly. We are thinking about ourselves enough. We don't need more awareness or answers. My worry is that after a lifetime spent trying to explain themselves, solve their strong feelings, standardize their personalities, and make sense of every experience, a generation might realize that the only problem they had all along was being human. This argument sort of teeters into like the mental health system is just a marketing scheme that's not helping you any because everybody was fine historically, so why does this matter now? Tone. You know, the good old days when all of mentally disabled people were warehoused in institutions for their entire life, queer people had to live their lives practically in hiding, everybody was forced to mask how miserable they were, and a huge chunk of lower support needs developmentally disabled people just thought they were worthless and were tormented endlessly by bullies for things that they couldn't understand. What a great time that was! How dare we have therapy and people talking openly about their feelings and their struggles today as they try to break cycles of trauma and maybe change how the world could be. How very self-centered of this generation. I also think her idea that you don't need to introspectively understand yourself or why you're making the decisions that you are making to live a good and happy life is misguided. It's giving, well, everybody was abused in my household and we all turned out fine, so why do you want something different? What's wrong with you? And my primary concern around this rhetoric of everybody's this identity that used to be less common now is beyond the subtext of basic conservative values, obviously. This sort of kids these days don't know who they are and can't make choices for themselves thing, in a way that specifically seems to target the less visible minorities, and is the same rhetoric that we see used around so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria as a way to try to deny the existence and healthcare needs of trans children. Now, I do think in my interactions with younger people and my active avoidance of certain online disability communities, diagnostic terms do come up way too much with too little understanding behind them. I very much believe this to be true. There's a lot of harm being caused. I also don't feel like this concept is particularly new historically, though it seems to be on the larger scale today because it used to be just a handful of terms at a time and now it's just the entire DSM. But to me, it's so clear that this is the fault of a society that only cares about your struggles if they have a concrete label, and where it's almost impossible to find easy community for reasons that all boil down to capitalism. It's an interesting conversation to have, for sure. I think she brought up some interesting points, and I initially went into this expecting to agree with her. This is not the argument I expected to come out of this with. Like, her points were primarily wrong and uninformed and have a very specific negative social agenda, but it did still lead to an interesting conversation, and that is something. The thing I want to leave this discussion of labels on is what I often bring up when I'm working in the theater when somebody wants to canonically diagnose a character or a historical figure with some sort of mental disorder, which is to ask yourself, why is this categorization important? If it is to justify a negative behavior or to fulfill a stereotype so the story makes more sense, absolutely not. Do not pass go. Maybe spend some time reflecting on why you wanted that in the first place, but let's not include it in the show. But if it's to give that person more nuance and more complication in a humanizing and interesting way to add more depth to the show through a lens of, see, they're just like me, and acknowledging that, you know, not disabled is not and should not be the default, let's see what we can do with it, right? Because that requires an understanding of diagnostics and of humanity and of historical disability and media studies that makes it something handled responsibly versus the first that typically just relies on pop psychology understandings of something that inevitably adds to further stigma. I know that everybody has different opinions on that. I also know that everybody has different opinions on diagnosing historical figures retroactively because of how period specific our diagnostic criteria are. For me, that falls into that latter why that we just talked about, as long as it's done carefully and with full acknowledgement of their original historical context. This ended up being longer than anticipated and also a bit more rambly and circuitous than anticipated, but I think that I crammed all the ideas in here somewhere. Again, I went into this expecting to defend a lot of a very interesting article, and then I read the article and I went, oh no, and that changed a lot of my thinking on this topic. I don't think constant labeling is hurting us as much as I thought it was initially, and the way that I initially intended to make this argument, now that I've had to argue the other side against this deeply strange and unprofessional piece of writing. So please let me know your thoughts on all the above in the comments. I would love to hear them, and as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.